Hey everyone, this is Thomas from Springfield Daily. We are in the Innovate Springfield studio in downtown Springfield. My guest today is Renato Mariotti, one of the Democratic candidates for Attorney General. Thank you so much for being here. So please, tell us a little bit about yourself and why are you running for Attorney General?
Wow. Well, I was born in Chicago. My dad's family's from Cicero. My mom's family's from Little Italy. So as you can guess, I'm Italian on both sides. My parents didn't go to college. They both worked two jobs to put me through school. My dad was a barber during the day and delivered papers at night. My mom worked at the local State Farm insurance agent during the day, answering the phones, and then at night she would sew crafts, and that's how we would make ends meet. When I was a kid, we moved out to Naperville, and I was fortunate to go to Naperville Central High School, and then I went to the University of Chicago, Yale Law School. Ultimately, I came back. Pat Fitzgerald hired me to be a federal prosecutor. I did that for almost a decade. I had a number of difficult, challenging trials that I took on. At the same time, I was fighting cancer. I won those battles, both in court and out. I left a year and a half ago, and since that time I've been talking all over the place, everywhere from television and newspapers, magazines, social media, about the Trump administration, their legal issues, the problems that we all face. When Lisa Madigan unexpectedly said, late last year that she was not running for Attorney General, it seemed like an opportunity to do something, take action against the Trump administration, and also to fight for working families like mine, and help the people who are struggling to make ends meet against people who are taking advantage of the system. So that's why I'm running for Attorney General, to fight back against the Trump administration and to fight for working people.
All right, well, we're going to have to ask about all of that. But first, I always want to give the guests the first topic. What's your number one issue?
Wow. I would say taking on the Trump administration. Donald Trump's election in many ways changed my life. When I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, I expected that I was going to be focusing on my private practice of law. I certainly worked on issues on the side. I helped get Tammy Duckworth elected. Did what I could for a number of other candidates, did work on environmental issues, on reproductive rights, but I did not think that I would be spending the vast majority of my time, pretty much every free second I had, writing about and talking about the Trump administration. But to me, this is a very unique time for our country. It's a dangerous time. The rule of law is under attack. The president's attacking the FBI and DOJ and the court system and our constitutional rights. And I want to look back at this time and be able to tell myself I did everything I possibly could to stand up and fight against that. And that's why I am running for Attorney General. I want to do whatever I can to hold Trump at bay. I think aggressive state attorney generals are our best and last line of defense against Trump.
All right, actually, that leads into one of my first questions about net neutrality, that the FCC repealed those regulations in December of 2017. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that move, and would you join the other 22 attorney generals who have already indicated that they are planning pushback against that decision?
Yeah, well, I talked about that decision, I think the day it came out. I did a thread on Twitter talking about it and explaining what net neutrality meant, because I think that the term net neutrality is something that's hard for people to get their heads around. It's not obvious what it means. The bottom line with net neutrality is it was a rule that prevented your internet service provider from discriminating against particular types of content or blocking it or throttling it or whatever. And what really makes me concerned about that rule change is, one thing that's been happening in our country is we've become more split apart, where you got Republicans watching their TV shows and Democrats watching theirs, and conservatives on their own radio and on their own social media, and the progressives on the other side. And what I worry about is the creation of, for example, internet service providers that you can imagine GOP, ISP, where you got the Republicans, and Sean Hannity touting that they'll filter out the liberals, they'll filter out the progressives, and vice versa. And then we've got even more of a balkanized society where we're not talking to each other. And we can't have that. I mean, we already have enough censorship. It's already hard enough to get your message out. And the internet is this one area where we really have freedom. So I think it's important. I was glad to see Eric Schneiderman was tweeting, I think the same day I was, about that decision. I was glad to see him file suit. I would certainly be part of that. I view it as a suit that is going to delay the implementation of the repeal for some time. It's also up to us to elect Democrats and do whatever we can to create bipartisan consensus for maintaining net neutrality.
And do you believe, as some other people in the race have said, that the internet is itself a utility at this point?
I think that has real legal meaning, because when something's a utility, it has a different status. I think there are real value in regulating the internet as a utility. I think that we need to have a broader view of what I'll call public goods are, and I think that the internet is so central to our entire way of life at this point. It's the way we communicate, it's the way we shop, it's the way we get around, and our GPS, right, if you're driving or walking. So I think it's so central to our lives that we need to make sure that it's public, it's free, it's open. Really, we need to have an aggressive law that if we can maintain net neutrality, a bill that will essentially codify by statute the freedom that we've enjoyed on the internet.
All right, and I guess jumping ahead to utilities in the race, campaign finance has been one of the major touchstones in this race. There's been a lot of talk about who's taking donations from who, and whether or not some of those donations are appropriate, especially for someone running for Attorney General. Yeah. Would you care to share your thoughts on that issue?
Sure. So this is my first time running for office, and I'm new to Illinois politics, and I was shocked in this race to realize that there was no contribution limits at all. So, one of my opponents gave himself, I think, $300,000 and then took a $150,000 check from one person. And, theoretically, a millionaire could just give $1 million check to somebody in the race. It's wrong. And it really, to me, it's embarrassing for our state as a citizen. I think we deserve better. We deserve to have a government where our elected representatives and the Attorney General is supposed to be our lawyer, are not, taking massive checks from special interests. So a few of my opponents have taken big checks from the utilities, from ComEd, People's Gas, etc. I think it's a major conflict of interest when you have the Attorney General responsible for being a watchdog against the utilities. That's a big, important part of the role. I think the same thing about tobacco. I think one of my opponents got $100,000 from a tobacco company, and there's a settlement with tobacco, and that's something that's within the Attorney General's purview. I think, from my perspective, what I've tried to do is run a race where I've relied on small dollar contributions, under $100. That's the vast majority of my contributions. My average contribution size is well under 100. And, my biggest fundraiser is my dog. I put photos of my dog Bear on Twitter. People can join Team Bear by tweeting back photos of their own dog and contributing to the campaign. And, Bear has raised over $100,000 for the campaign. But I'll tell you, one thing that being a candidate has taught me is you hear about money in politics, but there's a difference between hearing about it and seeing it and living it. And so few people are paying attention to this race. So much of it's going to be based on television ads. And I am working my butt off. You can tell I have a cold. It's because I'm working night and day trying to get the resources we need, trying to get the volunteers we need to counteract opponents who with one check can negate all the money that my dog raised in tiny contributions from thousands of people. And that's unfortunate. We deserve to have politicians who are financed from ordinary people, not from special interests.
All right, but again, you mentioned TV as being one of the major conduits. Twitter has now become one of the major sort of competing channels. Of course, the politicization of Twitter being fermented by Donald Trump, but I understand you were also very active on Twitter.
I think that's safe to say. I mean, if this election was decided on Twitter, I think I'd win in a landslide. I have a bigger Twitter following, I think is the term for it, than anybody in Illinois politics by a country mile. I think about bigger than Governor Rauner or J.B. Pritzker or anybody. That's because I don't use my Twitter account to give campaign claptrap or updates as much as I give it I use it as a medium to inform people. I started tweeting actively in May of last year, so it hasn't even been a year yet. And I talk a lot about legal issues and explain them for folks, help them understand the issues of the day. And people, become interested in reading my Twitter feed as a result. I think there's a value in communicating directly with people. It is a good way of reaching voters. I think it has helped me in this race. Certainly helped me raise money in small donations. It's helped me get volunteers, and I have a national volunteer base. Got people making phone and text banking from all over the country. But I think that there are limits to it, because obviously there's a lot of folks who just get their news from watching traditional television shows or radio or whatever, and that is why money does matter in politics.
All right, well, thinking of perhaps the biggest money issue, the stock market, I understand that you won the first case against a spoofer. For someone who didn't understand any of that intro, which there's probably more than a few, I was one of them. What is that, and why does it matter?
So there's something called high frequency trading. People talk about it sometimes. It was a minor issue in the last presidential race. Essentially what it is people using high-speed computers to trade at hyper-fast speeds, faster than the blink of an eye. A blink of an eye is 200 milliseconds. These people trade with less than 100, 10 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, that sort of thing. And there's been a lot of allegations that there's been manipulation in the markets. There was a book that had come out a couple years ago about it called Flash Boys that got a lot of people very concerned. Around a little bit after that time, I indicted a high frequency trader. It was a big deal at the time because there had not really been an indictment of somebody like that. I think that there was a feeling that you could never explain to a jury what high frequency trading meant. And spoofing was a law that had never been charged before. It was part of the Dodd-Frank Act. And what it means is spoofing is when you enter orders into an exchange, in other words, where people are going to trade, and you enter them without the intent to actually trade those orders. So essentially what it means is this. You know how you've seen on TV all these people waving their hands trying to trade? Well, nowadays it's all on a computer. And what happens is these people with the super fast computers would enter these orders and program them to cancel like that within 10 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds, whatever. And so what would happen is the rest of the world would see, oh my God, there's lots of people trying to buy corn or wheat or euros or whatever it might be. There's a lot of that going on, but all those orders were actually an illusion because they were just programmed to cancel as a way of tricking other people. So that's what spoofing's about. I was the first person to charge and convict someone of spoofing, and then I also convicted the same individual of committing fraud, which was also a pioneering development, because usually fraud is where you lie to people and get money. There I charged and ultimately proved that entering orders in a certain way, it's not a lie, the order itself isn't a lie, but it creates a misleading impression of the state of the market.
Well, and can you explain, in part because with the high-speed traders, for me that means big banks, and quite frankly I sort of don't care about big banks getting ripped off. Why should I care?
Wow. Well, it's not just big banks. What it is a lot of times is people who are using those markets for legitimate purposes. So I'll give you an example. One of the people that I put on the witness stand who was a victim of that crime was a man who was trading for Pilgrim's Pride, which is the biggest chicken producer in the United States. They produce chickens for KFC and for Walmart and lots of other places. So you've probably eaten some of their chicken without even realizing it. And they would buy a lot of corn, like in massive amounts of bushels of corn, and they would hedge that corn on the Chicago Board of Trade. In other words, they would lock in the price. Well, whenever he would try to buy his corn, he was opposite to the guy who was spoofing, and he was getting his orders messed up and wasn't able to complete the trades that he wanted to complete. So there are people doing legitimate trading on these markets, and that's really why those markets exist, and we have to make sure that the markets are fair for the people who are doing their job.
So this is in fact an issue that affects small-time individuals, not just nationally, but in the state of Illinois.
Well, absolutely, and think about it this way. Everybody's got money that's invested somewhere. And it may be that, it could be a small business where you got your jeweler who's got money invested in gold, but it also can be a lot of us who have our monies in our 401k accounts. And we don't have necessarily all have the savviest person on our side. There's nothing wrong with being savvy. There's nothing wrong with being smart. And I don't want to give the impression that being a smart trader is a bad thing, because it's not. but you have to make sure you're playing by the rules. And one thing that I helped pioneer was the enforcement of laws, both criminal and ultimately there's been a lot of civil enforcement around high frequency trading.
All right, so have you had any other high profile cases, anything that I understand you had to go into not witness protection but protective custody for a while?
That was definitely one high profile case. There was a guy called the secondhand bandit, Jose Banks, who was a serial bank robber, robbed a number of banks in a very violent fashion, would jump over the counters, take people hostage, put guns to their heads, hit them sometimes with the gun. There was somebody who had gotten PTSD, another person had a panic attack. I mean, very serious criminal. I put him behind bars, and the day that the jury came back with their verdict, he said he was going to get his retribution. He was going to come and get us and get his revenge. And he escaped from prison a few days later in a very dramatic way. So I was in protective custody during the pendency of that, and it was probably the first time in my life that I thought about my life coming to a swift end, and also potentially changing my life going forward, because when you got somebody like that doesn't like you and is out on the loose, it's a serious matter. And I've had a lot of other big cases too. Larry Freed, who was worth well over $100 million and had built the TIF system in the city of Chicago, the TIF fund, and as well as some of his business partners of a pretty significant amount of money, millions of dollars.
Thinking of things that are going to raise millions of dollars but are still questionably legal, medical marijuana is already a thing in the state of Illinois, and there's push for it to become recreational, legal as well. But at the same time, we're trying to combat another drug issue, which with the opioid epidemic. So are those two issues at odds for you, or are they totally separate?
They're not really at odds. I mean, I think with medicinal marijuana and ultimately legalization, I think that the goal there is to raise revenue and stop criminal prosecution of an activity that's not a serious crime. Particularly, we have a lot of law enforcement priorities in the state, and so the idea is let's make it legal, tax it, etc. By the way, I will say one concern with that is in the medicinal marijuana legalization, when we had that happen, there was definitely some concern about the way that those licenses were handed out. I think that a lot of people raised issues about whether or not insiders were getting certain licenses, and I do think when we do proceed to legalization, we need to make sure it's done in a way that is above board and that citizens can be proud of. But on the other side, of the opioid side, there is a opioid epidemic, and I think we need to take aggressive action against opioid manufacturers. That to me, what I think that the connection would be there is that ideally marijuana legalization would potentially help us on the opioid side of things. But those are very highly addictive drugs. It's easy to say that there's ways that we can combat addiction. Really what we need is treatment, and we don't have enough funds for treatment here in the state of Illinois.
On that note, and that's a really good point, I've got more questions about specific issues and your theory of politics, but we need to take a quick commercial break.
Okay.
So we'll be back in a moment. Hey everyone, this is Thomas for Springfield Daily Radio. I'm here in the studio with Renato Mariotti, one of the Democratic candidates for Attorney General. We were just talking about legalizing marijuana and his experiences as a prosecutor. I wanted to take a slightly different tack here and go with the Trust Act that created, quote unquote, the sanctuary state, and the other bills that have been put forward to create sanctuary zones, including schools, churches, and hospitals. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to get your view on that, especially in light of what you said about resisting Donald Trump.
Sure. So I support the Trust Act. I think that the approach that we've had is a good one. I think it's a good thing for the state. I'm concerned about the Trump administration trying to deny funding, particularly the city of Chicago, for the fact that it has a sanctuary city status. And I would help the city of Chicago in their suit against the Trump administration, even though a federal judge sided with the city and enjoined that action by the Justice Department. The Justice Department still has not released the funds that the city of Chicago is entitled to. In addition, I think that we have to resist the efforts of the Trump administration to force us to use our local, state enforcement resources to round up people Donald Trump doesn't like and try to help him deport them. I think we got a lot of priorities in our state, and it's up to us to determine how we use those resources. And so, frankly, I think that it is unconstitutional for the federal government to be interfering in state operations and state enforcement of its own laws and federal laws. So that would be something I would ultimately litigate as well.
Thinking of the city of Chicago, and actually, unfortunately, closer to home as well, gun violence has been a major issue in the state. Is there something that the Attorney General's office should be doing to help curb that that's not currently being done?
Well, I would be supportive of gun laws that seek to make it, for example, licensing of gun dealers, that make sure that we have guns in the right hands. But it's a difficult problem, and I think there's a couple things that make it very hard. One is that we've got states around us that have very weak gun laws, like Indiana, Wisconsin, so we get a lot of guns flowing across the border. We obviously already have a lot of guns, particularly in the city of Chicago, but elsewhere as well, that are in the hands of people illegally. And I think that we have certain areas of the city, Chicago, where there's a lot of poverty and a lot of despair, and frankly, people are put in a situation where they don't have a lot of choices and options. So I think investment in some of these communities is an important way as well. I think we do need to vigorously prosecute gun trafficking, but realistically, it's going to take a multi-pronged approach to solve that problem.
The state constitution, again, on a completely different tack,
Sure.
The state constitution supports and says that the education is important and that we want to have schools which ensure the educational development of all persons to the limits of their capabilities. Obviously, this protects individuals with disabilities, individuals who are struggling. I mean, there's a clear moral, legal obligation there. But how does that apply to elite individuals, gifted students, and other individuals at the top end of the spectrum?
So that provision is I think important in a statement of the goal of our Constitution. One shame is that provision has not been given much meaning by Illinois courts. Similarly, by the way, as a side note, there's a similar provision that I think also it kind of announces an important right, a right to a healthful environment, which isn't given a lot of meaning by Illinois courts either. And I think, because there had been suits many years ago about people in areas where they were disadvantaged, that there's a right that's essentially given in the Illinois Constitution to them getting an education that their kids deserve, and they brought a suit, and the Illinois Supreme Court wasn't going to get involved in making sure that you had a high quality education. I mean, the truth of the matter is every student in Illinois deserves to have a high quality education. They deserve to have the resources that they need. It's wrong that the zip code you live in determines how the quality of your education is. I do support the change in the formula in terms of calculating resources. I think that that's an important step, but we got to do a lot more. And particularly in the city of Chicago, I'm critical of the approach that has been taken lately, where there is, certain schools are marked as underperforming, and ultimately what ends up happening is those schools get closed down. We ship kids further away where they're going miles away. I think that ultimately hurts the kids' performance. At the higher end, obviously we want to help those kids as well. My biggest concern, though, is with students who are in schools that are not receiving the support that they need.
No, there's definitely more that can be done for education, that should be done for education. As our time starts to wind down, you mentioned that Lisa Madigan announced sort of unexpectedly that she would not seek re-election. Is there anything, and she's been Attorney General for some 16 years.
Yeah.
Over that time, is there anything that you thought she did particularly well and that you would continue with, or something that she sort of maybe didn't do as much and that you would prioritize more?
Well, I think she's done a great job with consumer issues, fighting for consumers. I think she's also done a very good job on environmental issues. I would largely continue her efforts in those areas, although I might have a little bit of a different approach to some environmental issues. In terms of differences between her, I definitely would have a different view regarding pensions. I would not have defended SB 1 as vigorously as she did. I think that law was obviously unconstitutional, and I think that the efforts that we spent on the public dime defending that were a waste of money. I also think that there's a perception in Illinois that our government is corrupt. There's a perception that even my own party's leaders can't be trusted. That's unfortunate. And I think we need to do more to, make sure that Illinois government is more open, it's more transparent, it's a government we can be proud of. And I don't know whether or not there's more she could have done or couldn't, because I don't know every detail, what she knew and what she did. But there's a perception out there that we're not doing enough, and I think that's something important where I would try to emphasize that to make sure that we can build trust in Illinois government.
All right, and on that note, before this race, I really hadn't thought of the Attorney General as being a partisan office. I mean, you are running as a Democrat, and that really, at the federal level, the Attorney General is appointed by whoever happens to be president. Is the Attorney General a partisan office, and maybe what does that even mean?
That's a great question. I think that, in many ways, the Attorney General should not be a political office. In other words, one thing, I'm not a politician. It's probably obvious by the way I answer the questions. I've never run for office, not an insider or anything like that. And I approach these things from a lawyer's perspective. Guys tried a lot of cases, investigated crime. I think we need to have somebody who's approaching these things as a lawyer and not trying to play politics with the lawsuits that we bring and the work we do at the AG's office. That said, there is a difference in values between the Attorney Generals on the Democratic side and the Republican. The likely Republican nominee has said she thinks that Donald Trump's doing a good job as president. She doesn't believe in a woman's right to choose. She's not for marriage equality for gay and lesbian people in Illinois. So there's obvious differences between me and her, and that would affect how we use the office. I would be fighting against Donald Trump. She'd probably be aiding him. I would be trying to defend reproductive rights. She would be trying to constrain them, for example.
And that it's not a perception of what the law is. It's simply a matter of priorities. Would you say?
I think there's also a difference in opinion of what the law is. I mean, in my estimation, the Supreme Court has made very clear that a woman has a right to choose whether or not she wants to have an abortion, for example. My likely Republican opponent in this race appears to not believe that is the case, or at the very least believes it's so morally wrong that we should do whatever we can and be aggressive to try to limit or constrain the right that was afforded by the Constitution. So, there are differences of opinion amongst lawyers as to what the law is. Some of it would be priorities, but there are some actual differences, I think, in terms of our legal positions as well.
No, that's it's important to say.
Yeah.
And you're before you get to challenge the person on the Republican side, you're in a very crowded primary.
Mm-hmm.
What makes you the standout candidate in a very qualified field?
Well, I think one important thing I mentioned a moment ago, I'm not a politician, I'm not an insider. I'm the only person in the race who's not an elected politician or somebody appointed by Rahm or Madigan or someone like that. I think that's important because I think we want an Attorney General who's not beholden to anybody, who hasn't been trading favors in Springfield for a long time in the Capitol building, but is somebody who's independent, who's going to be making the right legal decisions. That's the first thing. I also have the experience as a lawyer. A lot of these folks, would you hire as your lawyer somebody who's been, a legislator in Springfield for 15 years? You'd never hire that person to represent you in court. I'm somebody, I've tried cases almost every year. I think every year for the last several years. I've tried cases last year. I've investigated many crimes. I've handled cases in both federal and state courts, and civil and criminal, on the defense and on the prosecution side. I have the wealth of legal experience you need for the role. And I'm also somebody who's going to bring a different kind of perspective to it. I'm somebody who's a resistance activist. I'm somebody who is a citizen who's coming to the process from outside the system, and I think that that's important.
All right, and again, in that primary, which is March 20th, they often have very low turnout. What would you say, not to someone who's a card-carrying progressive or a card-carrying Democrat, but someone who maybe identifies as an independent or a moderate? Why should they come out and pull a Democrat ballot?
Okay, well, there's the Attorney General spot does not open up often. As you mentioned, it hasn't opened up for 16 years. There's a very good chance that the Democrat, the Republican primary is not as contested, but there's a very good chance that Democrat is going to not only be on the ballot, but could be the next Attorney General. And I think the choice really matters for the state. We're starting to see now how important the Attorney General's office is. We're seeing all these actions all across the country on the travel ban and net neutrality, a lot of these topics that we've discussed. Attorney Generals make a big difference in our lives, and it's something that's important. A lot of folks in this last presidential election stayed home weren't that involved. I know because I asked some of these people to try to help on the various campaigns and help our efforts, and they weren't willing to do that. And ultimately, what happened is Donald Trump became our president, and many of us I think are concerned about that. So I think elections do matter, and every vote matters, and as you correctly point out, could be a low turnout election.
No, well, thank you very much. Do we have time for one more? All right. During the Attorney General Candidates Forum last Monday, it was mentioned that the Attorney General's office is both underfunded and itself a revenue-generating office. Do you think that not only could we enhance justice, but we could enhance the financial state of the state of Illinois if we were to properly fund the position?
I agree, without a doubt. One thing I don't understand is the Attorney General's office has not had a request or approval for increased funding for, I think, 12 years. And it is an office where there's a lot of the resources are stretched from my conversations with staff and attorneys there. Why? I mean, it's literally like you just had a revenue generator, and essentially what it's doing is creating revenue that other agencies and other organs of the state government are taking money from. Really what we should be doing is fully funding that office. It's generating revenue, and allow us to have an Attorney General's office that can be really active on behalf of the people.
No, well, thank you. I mean, we're all for justice and doing what just makes good math sense.
Yeah.
Let's forget justice for a minute.
There you go.
Well, thank you so much. My guest today has been Mr. Renato Mariotti. He's a Democrat running for Attorney General in the state of Illinois. Your primary is again
March 20th.
And the Olympics just started. What's your favorite event?
Wow. Growing up it was figure skating, but I'll tell you lately I've really been impressed with the biathlon, because you talk about two totally different sports, right? Shooting and skiing. It's pretty cool.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for being here. And this has been Thomas Clatterbuck for Springfield Daily Radio.
Thanks a lot.
Great.
Real pleasure.
Great to have you.
Thanks a lot.